Hello and welcome to another episode of Bups's Dharma Lounge. This is a time and a place where you can just sit back, relax, maybe enjoy a beverage while we discuss all things Dharma. Hello, I'm Bupsa, Frank Jude, and this is Bups's Dharma Lounge. So I hope you have a nice drink and you're relaxed as we talk about suffering. It's going to be a short one today. But before I go into talking about suffering, I would like to again remind you that if you find this podcast enjoyable, helpful, you get anything at all from it, please support it. And the most perhaps valuable way that you can support it is by subscribing. So subscribe, share, spread the word. And if you're watching on YouTube, comment below. I'm open to hearing any questions, any suggestions for topics that you'd like to be covered during the podcast. Rate it. If there's ratings available, hit like or whatever it is. And of course, dana, any kind of financial offering, no matter how small or how large, it's all really gratefully appreciated. It's if you want to learn more about dana, an earlier episode, I talk about it as a practice of mindfulness, actually, and a pre-capitalist, anti-capitalist, if I might say, economic system of just sharing. Right? And in that light, I would like to acknowledge some people who have offered dana since the last episode dropped. Wiyong Terry Tater, Jishin Carolyn Hill, Hyokan Tatiana Staloff, and Gabion Sally Weber. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and it really means a lot to me. All right, so this episode is titled Suffering and the End of Suffering. And it's related to a quote attributed to the Buddha. And it said that he repeated it often when asked what his teaching was. And he said that I teach only one thing, suffering and the end of suffering. Now, some years ago, some smarty pants once said, isn't that two things? But obviously, if you truly understand what the Buddha is getting at, right, the causes of suffering and the consequences of suffering and the ending of suffering are not separate things. If you understand one, you understand the other. I got a missive from a listener, Susan, who wrote asking, help me here with this idea of the end of suffering being the goal. I've turned that around over and over, and I can't seem to grasp what that would mean. The human condition is so completely tied up with suffering and the idea of suffering. Bearing suffering well is a virtue in our culture. It's heroic. I can't imagine a being free from suffering. Can you? So it struck me this morning on the cushion, reciting, may I be happy. May I be peaceful. May I be safe. May I be free from suffering. What am I saying? I look around and I think that really I don't suffer from much. Relatively, my sufferings are really nothing. But the conditions still exist for great suffering. Currently, I'm not grieving the loss of a loved one. I have my health, I have a home, I have a job. But any of these things could change instantly and I would suffer. But I suppose that sort of suffering is temporary. It is certainly to be expected, and to bear it well is the most that I can hope for. So, is the freedom from suffering on some other level? Is it an attainable goal? Is it the Holy Grail? So again, back to what would freedom of suffering be like? Good question. And in all honesty, part of my response has to hinge on what exactly what exactly does the tradition mean by suffering? Obviously, The tradition wasn't written in English. So the word that is translated as suffering is dukkha. And it literally means wrong or bad space. I've also seen some people who translate it as wrong or bad hole. And while I understand that the scholars argue over the etymological sources of this word and all that, some people argue that it would be used to describe an axle that was misaligned in the wheel, in the wrong hole, in the wrong space. And whether it's true or not, I think it's a great image because, again, think about this. This is Iron Age India. And, if the axle was not in the center of a wheel on a cart, you would be in for a really uncomfortable ride, right? So the image is great, even if it's not literally the etymological source of this word. Now, others have tried to avoid the somewhat histrionic and dramatic sounding suffering by translating dukkha in other ways, like discontentment, dis-ease, unease, dissatisfaction, painfulness, and perhaps one of my favorite, Thanusuro Bhikkhu translates dukkha as stress and stressful. Right? The yoga tradition, including Buddhism, asserts that life, the human condition as we know it, is dukkha. And when we reject or turn away from the over-the-top sounding suffering and think of it as stressful, well, I don't think anybody would really argue about that, right? There's just lots of stress. And stress isn't always like negative. I mean, we need certain stress in order for trees to grow. They are stressed by the wind. Our immune system only develops if it's stressed. I read somewhere many years ago that the number one stressful thing for a partnership is the death of a partner, right? And the second most stressful thing for most humans is marriage. So, life is stressful. And in the earliest Buddhist understanding, it was said that a yogi could transcend and end dukkha by completely eradicating the causes of dukkha. And it was very clearly stated that the causes of dukkha are craving, aversion, and all forms of enmity, anger, hatred, all that, and ignorance. Right? These are the three roots of suffering. And an arahant means perfected, like a perfected one, is someone who has gone all the way, and they have, quote, done what must be done in order to purify his or her mind of these taints, craving, aversion, and ignorance, and in that way become free from dukkha. Now, here's the catch. Traditionally, as birth itself is understood to be dukkha, then literal liberation was taken to mean that the arahant would never be reborn into the wheel of samsara again. Right? So for most yogis who believe in either reincarnation or rebirth, and they're not the same thing, they would see that the ending of that cycle is the ultimate liberation, and only then is dukkha completely eradicated. Well, it makes sense, right? If you're no longer existent on this plane, then you're not going to suffer. But there have always been yogis who rejected that idea of rebirth. It's not just a modern thing that some of us Buddhists have adopted. And so throughout history, there have been yogis who rejected the literal teaching of rebirth, and they offered that dukkha is only present when there is grasping in the mind. Like for instance, the traditional understanding says that birth, aging, and death are inherently dukkha. So if the practitioner wants to end having to be reborn again and again, they have to end those cravings, those aversions, those ignorances, and therefore ending dukkha. But a more modernist understanding, such as that presented by Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, is that birth, aging, and death are only dukkha when the mind is grasping and resisting what is. But if the mind is not grasping, if those three roots, craving, aversion, and ignorance, are not present, then these phenomena are not dukkha. They're not inherently dukkha. It's our relationship to these experiences that make it dukkha or not. And then there's also a more radical naturalist understanding, right, that says dukkha is just inherent in life. All of life is afflicted, right? So dukkha can never really end or be escaped from. If you reject the idea of rebirth and you're born, as Buddhadasa says, from one womb, and you end up in one tomb, then all along your life you're going to feel and have stresses, afflictions. But how we relate to them will determine whether we can live a more liberated life or if we end up suffering through these life's unavoidable challenges. Now, this episode, it's a very short and perhaps even simplistic response. So if you're really interested in a much more developed view of the concept of dukkha, historically, and this more processive naturalistic understanding, then please check out my essay on dukkha and the Four Noble Truths in my blog, Zen Naturalism, which is linked in the description. It's a much longer foray into that. Okay, so thank you, and may you be well. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Bupsa's Dharma Lounge. I look forward to returning in about 2 weeks. And also, if you have anyone in mind that you might like to suggest a conversation, or if you yourself would like to engage in a conversation in a future episode, again, hit me up. You can email me at mindfulnessyoga.net. Meanwhile, stay well.